Welcome back. So if you were in your groups of three, I have a third question for you, and that's this. How many groups of three did everyone have the exact same answer, word for word? How many groups of three did everyone in your group have the exact same answer, word for word? I'd ask for a show of hands, but let me just tell you a story. I've asked that question numerous times in multiple different countries. In fact, just in the last few weeks, I was in a country where in about 6 different days, I was at 5 different schools. And out of all the times that we asked that question, how many people had the exact same answer? Out of all the different schools, there was one school that had 2 groups and one school that had 1 group. And in the one school that had 2 groups, when we asked them, what was your common answer? The groups both said, none of us knew. Here's the question. If for us as a school, if we don't have a clear, measurable definition for this question, what is spiritual maturity? Or if, as we look around the room, all of our teachers and all of our faculty and all of our administration have different answers, then we have a problem. Because if we're all going to different directions and defining spiritual maturity differently, there's a word for that. It's called relativism. And in a generation that we live in right now that is a relativistic, pluralistic culture where everyone can do that which is right in their own eyes, you and I, as teachers in a Christian school, if there's one thing that we cannot afford not to define, it's this question. We must have an answer to this question, and it must be a Christ-centered biblical answer. Because if one group over here and one group over here and one school over here and one school over here, if we all have different answers, imagine the kid who goes and transfers from one school to another and has 2 different answers. Or imagine that school where a student goes from grade 1 to grade 2 to grade 3 and has 3 different answers. Or the student who goes to period 1 in the morning and period 2 and period 3 and has a different answer all day long. See, if you and I have not clearly defined the Christ-centered definition for this question, then the truth is any definition is a good definition. And if I'm a student and I'm part of Generation Z, and any definition is a good definition, then who are you to tell me that my definition is wrong? Do you understand? Do you see the problem here? We might actually be teaching relativism without even realizing it. So what I want to do is I want to examine this question from Scripture. And I want to invite and encourage you to look at Scripture yourself and follow my definition and see if it's really my definition or if you can agree that this is what the Bible teaches. For me, when I look at this question, I go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. Because in Genesis chapter 1, God creates Adam and Eve. And in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, we get 2 different definitions. The first is called the doctrine of the Imago Dei. The doctrine of the Imago Dei teaches us that we, unlike the animals or any other part of creation, are created to reflect the image of God. The second definition that we get is the doctrine of the Missio Dei. And that is that God tells these new reflections of His that He wants them to fill the earth, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth with His glory. Now, think about this. You and I are created to mirror, to reflect. Now, we're not to become gods. We're not Arians. This isn't Jehovah's Witness where we become gods. It's not Mormons where we become a god and get a planet. This is a reflection, an imitation. We are created to reflect the glory of God. Now, look at what happens in Scripture. We go from Genesis chapter 1 to Genesis chapter 3. And in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve say, I don't want to reflect you and your will. I want to reflect me and my will. and that's called sin. And what happens is there's a separation that occurs between God and man. In Genesis 3:10, it says that Adam hid, he separated himself from God. Now, if we go a little bit further from Genesis 3 to Genesis 6, what we find is that as a human, as creation, what we ended up doing was we fulfilled one part of the mission, but not the other. It says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, that we filled the earth with our glory. In other words, we were fruitful and multiplied, but instead of filling the earth with the reflection of God, we filled the earth with the reflection of ourselves. And so you know the story. There's a flood, and then in Genesis 9, when Noah leaves the ark, God says, now go fill the earth with my glory. He says, be my reflection and fill the earth with my glory. The same mandate that he gave to Adam, he's now giving to Noah. Now, what happens is between Genesis 9 and Genesis 11, we see something else happens. In Genesis 11, it says that they build a tower. The people build a tower for two reasons. Number one, for their own glory. Number two, so they will not be scattered. See, what ends up happening is now we've fully gone away from the mission of God. Now we're not even wanting to scatter and fill the earth. We just want to be in one place, and we want to do it for our glory. We want to reflect ourselves and our will and our glory. And then in Genesis chapter 12, God turns to a man named Abram, and he says, you will fill the earth with my glory. And in Exodus, it says they were fruitful and multiplied, and they were fruitful and multiplied. And we see as the story continues into Scripture, that Solomon comes to a point where he dedicates the temple. And when he dedicates the temple, he says, now may this be a place that's not only filled with your glory, but where all the nations of the world can come and see your glory. Now think about how beautiful that picture is. Here's Solomon praying, and the fire comes down and fills the temple. And he prays that all nations would see the glory of God. Acts chapter 2 talks about the fire coming from heaven on the day of Pentecost and doing what? Filling the new temple, the new church. Now you and I are that temple, and what are we given by Jesus? Well, Jesus in Matthew chapter 28 says, I want you to go, what? Fill the earth with my glory. See, now you and I are that temple that Solomon prayed for. And we get to go out and we get the mandate that Adam was given. We get the mandate that Noah was given. We get the mandate that Abraham was promised to go out and fill the earth with his glory. We get the mandate that Solomon prayed for. And now we get to go fill the earth with God's glory. That's why in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1, Paul writes this. He says, be imitators of God. Now think about that for a second. You and I were created to imitate God. Jesus commissioned us to imitate God. Paul reminds us that we are called to imitate God. Now, if you and I take that into our own hands, then we ask the question, well, what does it look like to reflect the image of God? What does that even look like? And typically what would happen is we would have a board retreat. We would have a time where we all got together and we asked the question, what does it look like to imitate God? And what would end up happening is we would have a whiteboard and we would say, let's come up with a list. And so somebody would mention the 10 Commandments, and somebody else would mention the Beatitudes, and someone else would perhaps mention the fruit of the Spirit. And pretty soon we would have this long list of all the different characteristics that we think it looks like to imitate God. But what's the problem with that? The problem with that is when we come back from our retreat, we would need to change the name of our school so that we would be a Jewish school. Because what we did is we just put our entire school under the law and told our students that to be spiritually mature, they need to keep the list. See, lists lead to legalism, because what ends up happening is if I have a list, I either end up being a good kid or a bad kid. If I'm a good kid, I keep the list. I'm a good kid and I keep the list, and God's lucky to have me on his team. Or I live in despair and I realize that I'm a bad kid. But the problem with that is that it's not accurate theologically, because the Bible teaches that there's good kids. No, it doesn't. The Bible teaches there's bad kids and Jesus. See, if we understand from a theological perspective that we can never keep the list, then we have a need for the gospel. Otherwise, if we're teaching legalism, then what we're actually teaching is that if I try hard enough, I can do it on my own. So we realize that we don't want to do that, so we go back and have a second board retreat, and we take the big long list, and we play rock, paper, scissors, and we try to get it down to 7, because somebody mentions that 7 seems like a biblical number, and so we end up with 7 characteristics that we think help us to define what it means to reflect God. And of course, the problem with that is that we just moved from legalism to moralism. Because now what we are doing is we are defining, we are telling God what it looks like to reflect him. That is religion. That is the sin of Cain. Remember what got Cain in trouble? God said, I want you to worship me like this. And Cain said, I want to do it like this. I will approach you on my own terms. So we don't want to be legalists and we don't want to be moralists. So what do? I would suggest that we look at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2. Because in Ephesians 5, verse 1, it says, be imitators of God. And then it goes on to say, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love. And then here's the key, just as Christ. See, spiritual maturity is not a list. It's not a set of characteristics. It's a person. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. What we are called to do is be imitators of God, just like Christ. Spiritual maturity is when you and I reflect Jesus. We were created to reflect. We were commissioned to reflect. And we're called to reflect. See, that's the heart of what discipleship is. The heart of discipleship is that Jesus said, if you follow me, I will make you. Jesus is in the process of making us into his reflection. That's why the word disciple means little imitator. The word Christian means little Christ, little follower of Christ. You and I have a high calling. We are called to bring the reflection of Christ into our circles of influence around the world. Imagine the privilege that we have as Christian school teachers, where God has entrusted each one of us with a very specific circle of influence, your classroom. And together, we have these circles of influence where we get to reflect Christ all around the world.